This is terrific. Please kick us off, James.
Okay, well, I was told I have to come over to the center of the room for the YouTube recording, but welcome folks online. My name's James Farmer. This is the Ostrom Workshop Monday Colloquium. Good afternoon, everybody. My name again is James, and I'm the acting director of the Food and Agrarian Systems program, a new program here at the Ostrom Workshop. And Sara is our inaugural guest that we brought in as part of that program. But before we get started, wish to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities native to this region and recognize Indiana University Bloomington is built on indigenous homelands and resources. And we recognize the Miami, the Delaware, the Potawatomi, and the Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land, which seems like a really timely acknowledgement given today's talk and the history of the settlement and of the Great Plains. But we're pleased to have Dr. Sara Gregg be with us today from IU's Department of History. I believe you joined us during the COVID years and as part of the Prepared for Environmental Change initiative. So it's great that you're part of the campus and getting you over here to the workshop. Her research focuses on land policy, environmental change, and agricultural history, and her current work examines the process of state formation in the U.S. and the West, exploring developmentalist funding regimes and programs of land seizure and redistribution. Today's paper is really a chapter to her new book that she's working on, Illegible Land. And the title today is Free Land, Hidden Histories of the Homestead Era on the North American Great Plains. It's a bit different than the normal sort of standalone paper talks, and I'm really excited about. I'm actually really excited to read the book. So I don't know when the book's coming out, but it's. I'm sure you're ready to finish it up, and I'm ready to read it. But we'll start off with Sara's presentation today, and then we'll have a good lively Q&A. So please take it away, Dr. Gregg.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James, and thank you very much for having me. I first came to IU in 2002. As a grad student, funded by the Ostrom Workshop through SciPec, the Center for the Study of Institutions, Population, and Environmental Change. It was a transformative, truly transformative experience. I was the only historian among a bunch of social scientists. And the goal of the I'm going to just set the timer so I can keep an eye on where I am. And the goal of this seminar was 2 weeks introducing humanists and social scientists to the spatial practices of GIS and remote sensing. And this was work that I really wanted to do when I was writing my dissertation. It's work I've continued to do sort of over the course of my career. And Bloomington taught me a lot of things. Those couple of weeks that taught me that I could live in the Midwest. It taught me that college towns associated with great public universities are the best. And I've jumped around to a bunch of those over the course of the last couple of years, decades. So it's a pleasure to be here again. And thank you all for having me. So my talk today is actually the introduction, derived from the introduction to my book, which originally was called Free Land. It was later called Little Piece of Earth. It was later called Prairie Metamorphosis. And today it is called Illegible Land. And so I have as the backdrop a photograph I took in Montana in 2016, which I wanted to use to ground you in the landscapes of the Great Plains. And, you know, we're going to be walking through a number of them over the course of today's conversation, but I just wanted to introduce you. This is Tampico, the township of Tampico, just north of the Milk River, historical Assiniboine, Gros Ventre, and Dakota lands, and a pretty beautiful place. So like I said, the book I'm working on is called Illegible Land, Hidden Histories of the Homestead Era on the Great Plains. And essentially my goal in this book is to contextualize the history of land policy in the US during the long homestead era, as I call it, from basically 1804, as you read about, until the present. I'm a historian. While policy and economic policy actually are pretty central to my work, it's not necessarily the language that I use primarily as I write. And so I wanted to just make it clear the ways in which some of the frameworks that the Ostrom Workshop has developed actually inform my scholarship. And so just to walk you through these, my research, this project is in fact a series of nested case studies of land use, land cover change. And I'm using polycentric analysis, but over the longue durée, if you will, to analyze the contact zone on the North American Great Plains. And the workshop meeting last week, talking about environmental knowledge and policy making, I thought was a really useful reminder of just how central environmental knowledge is to this project, especially as it relates to resource systems. A fundamental project of the Homestead legislation was, in fact, privatizing or enclosing or dismantling Great Plains Commons. And so that's really a central part of my interest. I'm also doing institutional analysis. I'm looking at the place of the grasslands in American myth and history as it's exported abroad, as well as used rhetorically here in the US. And again, thanks to the Ostrom funding back when I was a baby graduate student, I used the spatial humanities to reorient my approach to studying environmental and political change. So we're in the forested regions of Northern Appalachia, I would argue, but I am focused today on the grasslands. So this orange area here at the heart of the continent, as my colleague Ted Steinberg describes it, this is the breadbasket of North America, a geological accident that has made the United States the nation that it is today. These nice little red dots roughly situate us, actually, that dot is a little high, the three places I'll be talking about today. So I set off on this project wanting to write a national history of the Homestead era. And so I was going to write about the Great Basin bioregion. I was going to write about the Southwest. I was going to write about the Great Plains and the Pacific Northwest and sort of touch on the various landscapes that were affected by homesteading. And then the data totally did not serve my purpose. The vast majority of homesteading took place on the Great Plains. And I agonized for a couple of years about that because I didn't really want to write a history of the Great Plains. And then I was forced to recognize that actually that's where it makes the most sense to talk about these questions. And so we're going to be talking about grass an awful lot. So I use, at least maybe not in the book, but in my mind, the construct of a monolith to help situate my work. And so the first time I came across this was through the work of my former colleague at KU, Dan Hermes, who is a geologist, who was taking these soil samples, essentially, along a stream bed as a means of mapping geological change in northeastern Kansas. And so these layers of essentially accumulated change helped to inform an art exhibit that he helped to co-curate back a long time ago. And I thought about those monoliths a lot in the following years. And then when I encountered James Weaver's work on prairie plants and their environment, and how he and his ecological team back in the 50s in Nebraska were basically taking a core of soil and examining the interrelationships of plants and bacteria and fungal communities in these areas as a means of understanding how prairies operate. That helped me think about monoliths a little bit differently. And then a grad student I was working with at KU at the University of Kansas, Theo Michaels, is using monoliths as a way of reseeding healthy prairie communities as part of prairie restoration projects. And so monoliths in general are kind of like both informing my work as a way of understanding the layers and the interconnections between these histories and these places and these communities. But the book itself is structured, as you read about in the introduction, around a musical form, basically sort of the waxing and waning of human and natural communities as they move through time. And so here's a slide that gives you a sense of that. I'm going to spend my time today actually walking you through how this works. So the exposition is the opening of each of these 3 movements that I'm charting across the Great Plains, giving the reader a sense of place. A lot of histories of the Great Plains failed to capture the essence of this place for me. And I got frustrated by the sensory flatness of the descriptions. And I vowed not to do that. I'm a photographer, and so a lot of these pictures are almost all mine. But I also have taken a lot of like audio and visual records as a means of getting my audience to understand these places, although you have no audio files today. But so the Great Plains and their native animals offer more than just ecosystem services. And so even though I start each chapter or each set of chapters with a native species, the Kansas chapter starts with the coyote, the Oklahoma section movement starts with the rattlesnake, who just happens to cohabit with prairie dogs and burrowing owls pretty frequently. And so that sort of interconnection of these often conflictual species, I think, is a really important part of this story, both for my analysis and for understanding the Great Plains. And I talk about pollinators, so the bumblebee. So a rattlesnake is a carnivore, the coyote is a scavenger, the bumblebee is a pollinator, but these are not just about providing economic benefits to humans or to the community more broadly. These are really about understanding how these systems work, because I think that's a central part of the history of these often overlooked landscapes. So I talk at some length about these natural areas, about the animals that live within them and how they can offer us insights into these places. But the real heart of the book ends up being these areas of development and recapitulation, where I examine the interplay between indigenous nations and the evolving nation state in the contact zone and over this period of transformation as the surveyors essentially move into indigenous territories and try to map them out for the purposes of the state, as James Scott talks about, making them legible and commodifying the territory for exchange. And so I wanted to essentially chart that process for you. So this is an 1864 map, published just 2 years after the Homestead Act was passed, that shows the progress of the survey, if you will, into Kansas and Nebraska as surveyors moved literally on foot, carrying heavy iron equipment and all the food they could muster, essentially, and moving out into unknown landscapes, largely hostile, filled with people who were hostile to their intentions, and yet deeply understood already by, at this point, probably hundreds of thousands rather than millions of people. And so I want to disrupt this notion of this orderly progress where you have here in this 1893 lithograph, these 2 indigenous Americans, left in a cloud of smoke, quite literally, as in this like nature area where you have a couple of like traders and canoes there. But to the left of the screen, you see, progress, settlement, sort of progressing across the plains. Well, if you've read the introduction, this piece, Free Land, you know that the progress was not consistent or constant or even reliable. But this idea that there was some sort of process that could be understood to find American history for a good 80 or 90 years. In recent decades, that narrative of progress has once again been complicated. And so a big part of my research has been understanding the various indigenous claims and uses of these grasslands. And so this is a map of roughly what is now Kansas, and you see all of the various nations that shared and often competed for the usufruct rights to this land. These peoples were displaced, as we all know, over time, in part by peoples who had come from here. And so here you've got, the Shawnee Reservation, the Delaware Reservation, the Potawatomi Reservation, the Sac and Fox Reservation. And these are all peoples who were moved from Indiana and neighboring areas and pushed to Kansas and then subsequently down south to Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And you see that this is 1854, a map showing indigenous holdings under treaty rights. And here you see 1857, they're largely erased and replaced by the surveyor's grid. Here we have an 1875 map of Indian Territory, what is now Oklahoma. And if you can see, this is Cheyenne and Arapaho land under the treaties of Medicine Lodge, 1867. Creek country, these are from the 1830s treaties. Potawatomi lands, they're here now. Seminoles from Florida, all sort of crunched into a landscape that looked very unfamiliar to most of them. And by 1893, this map of Indian Territory looks quite different. Everything has been redivided and subdivided again into lands that were shortly thereafter or had already been distributed to homesteaders as part of a federal land redistribution program. Similarly, I'm talking about northeastern Montana. Just to give you a sense of situate you, the Cherokee Outlet is the central pivot point of my Oklahoma movement. Northeastern Montana was right along the Milk River here, is the third site I'm focused on. And I'm looking at the ways in which what was called the Blackfeet Reservation under an 1855 treaty was broken down and dismantled and redistributed over the course of the following decades. So here is a 1914 map of homestead lands, emphasizing the opening of the Fort Peck Reservation in a land lottery in 1913, designed to, use up the surplus lands no longer needed by the Assiniboine and the Dakota peoples. So the book focuses on a bunch of policy changes, these various and sundry homestead laws that were continually revised and reimagined as a way of addressing evolving understandings of the land and the nation's needs. And then the other big part of this book is what I call the recapitulation, where we've got homesteaders and settler migration dominating the story. And the whole project pivots upon three moments of homesteading success. 1878 in Kansas, 1901 in Oklahoma, and 1917 in Montana. And so what you see is these are the 8 states with the highest levels of homesteading final proofs. As you see, there's nowhere outside the plains on this chart. The rest of the lines are largely flatlined, if you will. And so these data were the ones that ultimately sent me deep into the plains. The idea here, as articulated by Frank Mondell, a congressman from Wyoming, was that without constant revision, federal land policy would not be able to successfully settle the Great Plains in particular and the West more generally. You know, we want settlers and we want them now. We want to give them enough of these lands so that if they have enough nerve, courage, and stick-to-itiveness, they may establish a prosperous American home. Oops. And so to do this, to explore this process, I look at 3 homestead families. The first came from Vermont to Wisconsin and ultimately to Delphus, Kansas in 1871, the Cheevers and their extended family, the Newmans. And so here's a letter I found in Wisconsin from Adelia Cheever to her brother Silas in Wisconsin, talking about their earliest days on their homestead. The second family I followed was a family who actually originated in Marion, Indiana, in Grant County, moved out to Kansas in the 1870s, and then down to Oklahoma in 1893 as part of the Cherokee Outlet land rush. And so they didn't bust in Kansas, but they moved down for what was called the Cherokee Strip in 1893. The father of the family made the land run. He clearly had a great plan. He moved in the company of about 10 other African-American men, and they found a really auspicious and well-chosen set of 160-acre parcels in the far southern reach of the Cherokee Outlet, and stayed until the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, essentially making their farms there. The land rush, those of you who've seen Far and Away, that is the one that Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise engaged in that somewhat problematic film. But it was actually the greatest horse race of the century, as people described it. And then I follow a single woman homesteader by the name of Lily Stearns from actually just across the border in Illinois, up to Saskatchewan, down to Iowa, and then out to northeastern Montana and Glasgow. And she was essentially looking to the land to find a way to stabilize her family's future, and had many mishaps along the way. I've linked here in the slides a virtual exhibition I produced on her experience that's on the Environment and Society portal at the Rachel Carson Center, essentially mapping out her experiences and her expectations for these lands. And I conclude each of the movements into these 3 states with a coda that follows these stories to the present day. So here is Kansas today. The section I'm writing about is a mixture of agricultural and ranch lands. The Oklahoma section is actually ranch lands and a lot of oil and gas, which may or may not be paying, but there's nobody to be seen for miles and miles. There are no houses. There's one barn still standing. And then the Montana story, actually, the family that was contesting Lily Stearns' claim ended up ultimately buying it off in the 1950s, and they're still ranching it today. So here is that original homestead from the truck of the descendant of one of these families. Here he is looking at his grandparents' homestead. So this is a story of a place that is now once again underpopulated, that is contested as part of the uncertain future of the American economic development, and yet is very, I would say, pregnant once again with opportunity. So this is also a story about resurgences. And so here is a red quartzite boulder being moved from its position on a pedestal in a park in the center of Lawrence, Kansas. This rock, whose name is Injuje Wahobé, was a sacred Kansa site. It had been situated somewhere in the heart of the Kansas River up until 1929, when a bunch of city fathers in Lawrence coordinated its removal from the river and replacement in a park in the heart of Lawrence. They put it on this pedestal here and put a plaque on honoring the founders of the city of Lawrence. They chiseled off part of the rock. They defaced in Juge-Wauchobe, and then you called it the Pioneer Memorial until earlier this year, when a project that I was part of beginning in 2019 successfully returned in Juge-Wauchobe to the Kanza people. They moved it about 2 months ago, maybe a month ago, and it's now sitting in Alagawehu Park, which is part of the Kaw Nation's ceremonial capital in Kansas, even though the reservation is now located in Oklahoma. This is not just a Great Plains story, though. There's incredible research emerging from Indigenous scholars now that helps to situate my work and the understanding of the Great Plains in the United States more broadly. And so the scholar Elan Puchedli is mapping Potawatomi presences in Indiana through a process he calls restorative cartography. And this is like really helpful and engaging and really appropriate work. And I'm hoping that we can bring him to IU to give a talk in the next couple of weeks. This is also an important part of the stories that people are telling about rural America today. And so just this afternoon or today, the New Yorker has published a piece called Beyond the Myth of Rural America, written by a former undergrad of mine, who's using part of the Homestead Act as a way of understanding the promise and the perils of land policy and ideas of promise on the plains today. So I'm going to leave you with that. I welcome questions, comments. This is the first time I have, whoops, I should actually leave it on there. The first time I've presented this work to a bunch of policy folks. And so I do look forward to your questions and feedback. Thank you so much.
Well, in our colloquium tradition, we'll start off with a grad student question. And for those of you that are new, we sort of just go around the room, first come, first serve with questions. But if you have, let's see, if you have a question, it's a follow-up on another one, like hold your hand up, but fingers to the side. Is that correct?
That's great.
But you know,
Yes, hands, doesn't matter.
so anyhow, so does a grad student or a student, undergrad too, want to start us off with a question? Not to put you on the spot.
Super extra credit for the
I know, right?
history undergrads who are here by force compulsion.
Well, okay, well, think about your question. We'll come back to you. So we'll just open the floor up to anybody, or I know maybe even online as well. Deanna?
Sara, thank you so much for your presentation. It was great to read about your work and to know a little bit more of what you're bringing here. I'm a historian and geographer, so this all makes a lot of sense. I wanted to ask you about your methods, if you could tell us a little bit more about the archival work, because in a sense, I feel like you had to trace a lot of silences there and the place of silence within your own archival work.
Right. So absolutely. I mean, the silences have been a huge challenge. I've spent a lot of time doing genealogical research for this. And that was one way that these stories could become visible to me. I have some letters from the family that homesteaded in Kansas. I have some letters from the family that homesteaded in Montana, actually quite a huge collection of letters from the Montana story. But the records of indigenous nations from the 19th century are primarily coming through the state. And so that has required doing a lot of cross-referencing and contextualization. And I don't know if I'm using innovative methods, but I'm using methods that many scholars who are working on African-American history in the 19th century are having to use. Like, again, reading against the grain, looking into these, like you said, archival silences. I also was trying to figure out how to tell these stories using a representative person or group of persons in these moments that seemed important, but I'm sorry to jump through, but not necessarily illustrative. And so, as I said, I've chosen these 3 peaks of homesteading success, and then I sort of moved backwards. And so I knew I wanted somebody who homesteaded and finalized their claim in each of those years. And then when I looked at the map of Kansas, that's where I started, I saw that the place, there's like, I wanted to use the federal land office, the general land office, the land office where the highest number of proofs within that state had been issued during that particular year. So the federal record keeping is quite elaborate. And so I could trace the place where there was the highest concentration of homesteading during that moment. And then I looked at the map of that area and I saw all these Vermont place names. And my family is all from Vermont. And I thought, okay, so I'm going to cross-reference the census with the homestead records and find a Vermonter. So I did. And he is awesome. And so that was my point of entry to the Kansas story. In Montana, I was again sort of like casting about frantically looking for some way to find a person. And when I was at the Montana State Historical Society, I came across these letters by this woman, Lily Stearns, my Vermont/Kansas guy. His name is Elihu Cheever. So Lily Stearns was writing all these letters to the Secretary of the Interior. Dear Secretary, I want you to help me right now. I need your help because this bad Norwegian is trying to take my land. I mean, and so she had all of these really expressive and evocative letters talking about her trials and tribulations on her claim. And so I thought, well, she seems kind of interesting. And so I then sort of moved back through her story and got a sense for her experiences on the land, how she and her ex-husband had homesteaded in Saskatchewan and had a massive falling out. And there's like sort of a religious angle to her experiences, and then, you know, some complicated family politics as well. And then in Oklahoma, I was looking for a person who had made the land run, who represented the sort of movement out of the Midwest into Oklahoma. And I discovered that there was this contingent of African-American homesteaders who made the run together. And so I selected this guy who had been born in Indiana and followed him across the map. And, you know, each of these stories proved to be, you know, both very illustrative and very typical of the times, and allowed me to get into the big policy shifts and economic challenges and social changes, while also representing this sort of diversity of experiences of different people moving into the land. Does that help to?
Interesting.
Very weird,
Read your book.
very weird project, but I think it kind of comes together at the end. Thank you.
Well, just a note for those online, if you don't mind raising your hand, it'll sort of bring you to the top of our screen. But I know Scott, you're up next, then Jamie, then Doc.
No worries. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we will have to do an Ocean Book Club event if you're willing, Sarah, when this comes out, because I think there's a lot of us who are really keen on digging in. Terrific talk. I'm fascinated. Very well done. I just had a quick kind of a side type question, just thinking back to the weekend in Australia and the failure of the plebiscite there. And so I think, you know, you're rightly focused on this story of the Great Plains, but I think it does have some global resonance as well. And since this is the introduction, I'm wondering if you're planning to kind of connect the dots a little bit with what we're seeing in Canada, but also to an extent in Australia and New Zealand about the these policy changes that are being tried to kind of bridge this divide. Because in some of those discussions, the US is held up as a bit of an example because we have these treaties, but as you're pointing out, obviously things did not work out very well here either.
No, I mean, so yes, I mean, the work I'm situating very like deliberately within this larger settler colonial framework. I'm not actually, so I've read in those materials, I'm mostly looking at the global context insofar as there's this vision of opportunity in the United States that is drawing people from elsewhere, and the ways in which opportunity in the United States is then exported as like the myth of the West. But there are such important parallels, I would say, with the stories in other settler colonial contexts and nations and regions. I think primarily, I guess the answer to that is it's on my mind, and it doesn't really fit into the book as I have it mapped out, in large part because it's currently sitting at 650 pages. And my editor is not super thrilled about that length. And I have a lot of refinements still to make. But it's in conversation with the literatures coming out of Australia and Canada in particular.
Could be the next one.
Yeah, great question though.
We're gonna switch online. Jamie, you wanna go ahead?
Sure, happy to. Thank you for your talk, Sarah. I'm always fascinated to learn more about the Midwest and how it was settled. So a question I have, because I am from Oklahoma, is the connection of the Cherokee Strip to the rest of Cherokee Nation. Because I had to look up the map. You know, I saw Clio Springs and I was like, that does not sound like any of the towns that I'm used to because of living in, of living near or in the air, Northeast Oklahoma, which is Cherokee Nation, right? And
Where are
Cherokee
you from?
Tulsa.
Okay.
Tulsa is Creek, Muskogee, and then I'm actually from a suburb that is Cherokees. Well, Cherokee Nation. So Tahlequah is like an hour and 15 minutes from
Okay.
where we are. So Tahlequah, for everyone who's in the room, Tahlequah is the capital of the Cherokee Nation, and so my familiarity, of course, is the newer maps of where the Cherokees are now. So this Cherokee Strip is interesting to me because it's not even connected to what is now the Cherokee Nation. Like it looks like it's separate. It's kind of divided from other parts of the nation. So yeah, thanks.
So the Cherokee Outlet is a very it dates back to I think it's actually the 1828 treaty, and then sort of woven into the 36 treaty and then the 66 treaty as a perpetual outlet for the Cherokee to hunt bison, which they did not do generally by the end of the 18th century. I mean, there were eastern bison, but these were plains bison, and the Cherokee had a pretty substantial territory in northeastern Oklahoma or northeastern Indian Territory. And so it's not entirely clear what the logic of the outlet was initially, but it was reinterpreted as surplus lands by the US government beginning in the 1870s. And the Cherokee kept trying to sell it to the US from the during the 1870s and 1880s. They needed money to basically support their communities. And the US would not buy until grazing interests in Kansas began pushing for a perpetual lease or sale of the outlet that then was essentially villainized by the Eastern press and Midwestern congressmen as a land grab. And so then ultimately the US forced the sale of the Cherokee Outlet in 1891 to 1893. The sale took place for it was about 6.5 million acres. I think the total purchase price was $7.8 million. So it's about $1.41 an acre overall, which is, more than many indigenous nations received for their land rights. But the Cherokee had not really used the outlet. And in fact, a number of other nations had been resettled into that region under the terms of the 66 Treaty. And it was like prime grazing land. And so this is like right along the route of the Chisholm Trail, like the cattle trails from Texas. And so the Cherokee and the various other nations in that part of Western Indian Territory were leasing the land out to cattlemen or charging tolls on cattle moving through as a way of making some money. And that entrepreneurial effort on the part of these nations was considered to be a violation of their principles. And as a consequence, the land was essentially reclaimed by Congress. It's a very strange story. And in fact, Lee Alston, who directed the workshop for a period, wrote a really great article on the Cherokee Outlet land transfers. That was really helpful for me to understand how this all kind of took place in an economic sense.
We got Doc, then Mike, then Wes, then Gustavo. So Doc, you're up.
Thanks. Wonderful talk. Thank you very much for that. I'm wondering if you visited how the Europeans especially were recruited to come to the U.S. and how they were paid for. I've read some stuff in the past. I can't find it again about how this is a really great advertising success, mostly by the railroad industry. And so I'm interested in your take on how the growth of the railroad industry and how they needed to, I'm told, I don't know, to settle these lands. They just saw an opportunity in settling lands along the way between Eastern manufactories and Western mining districts, and how that played out as well. And I say it also in the context of family lore, because my mother's side is all Swedish. They were homesteaders that came over from Sweden in the late 1800s during that period. So, and she grew up in Napoleon, North Dakota, named after some other Napoleon, not Bonaparte. And the paper there is still called the Napoleon Homestead. So
Oh, wow.
it's strong in family history, but there's also respect for the Indians as well. So it's an interesting thing personally, but I'm just wondering how these people were recruited.
So quick question, was that like near Devil's Lake, the former Napoleon, or further west? Do you have a sense?
It's sort of south central. It's southeast of Bismarck. I don't recall a lake ever being mentioned.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I asked because there's a big Swedish community around Devil's Lake, a reservation in northeastern North Dakota that Karen Hansen has written about. So the railroads are a really big deal, especially in the Montana story. And so the Great Northern Railway, which was a James J. Hill enterprise, was really keen to connect the centers of Minneapolis and St. Paul with, I guess it's Seattle, maybe, I think it's Seattle, and the apple country and the wheat belt of Eastern Washington. And so Hill lobbied really, really hard, both overtly and covertly, in 1886 and 1887 to have Congress grant him a right of way across the what is known as the Blackfeet Reservation. And so Congress indulged him pretty explicitly in 1887. And he and his team built like 530 miles of track over the course of that summer, 7 miles a day in some cases. And for a number of decades, that train ran mostly empty. They were able to bring apples east and some wheat east and some people west. But ultimately, Hill and the Milwaukee Line and the Great Northern Line in 1908, 1909 began this big publicity surge that coincided with the passage of the Enlarged Homestead Act, which granted 320 acres rather than 160 acres on the more arid and semi-arid parts of the plains. And so that was a huge factor in bringing people from mostly Norway and Sweden into these parts of North Dakota and Montana. But it also brought a lot of people from eastern cities into this region. The railroads, you know, they published their brochures in German and in Yiddish, in Swedish and Norwegian, and essentially sought to capitalize on the desire of people from northern Western and even Eastern Europe to move to the United States. But ultimately, this was actually kind of it was an important part of the move into the northern plains. The railroads were somewhat important in the southern plains, but the publicity movement in the early 20th century was actually the most significant in driving migration, especially from Europe. But there was not really payment of potential homesteaders, but they offered subsidized rates. So you could get like an immigrant rate, which essentially cut the cost of the ship fare and then the railroad fare, and could actually like write off some of the cost of the land entry as well. It's a great question.
I think, and he's got another follow-up that I'll ask if there's time permitting at the end. Mike McGinnis, you're up.
Quick transition there, James. I wasn't quite expecting it that quick.
Sorry.
You said you were a little concerned about presenting to a policy audience. So let me ask you a policy question and sort of push in that direction. You start in your beginning of your chapters laying out just how mismatched the American policy was, national policy was at the time, to the conditions on the ground there, to try to get these individual pieces of private property, small scale private property, that just didn't fit the kind of lifestyle or livelihoods that would be consistent with that. And one of the things I've always found interesting around the workshop is this kind of constant dance between, you know, ecological reality on the ground and the policy changing, and to what extent they're making adjustments to each other. And I'm curious, you've looked at some, I mean, the Homestead Act is I think a really underappreciated policy change in the growth of the American national state. And in some places has been seen as really successful on its own terms, kind of in helping build that. But you've got this long line of adjustments to the policies at the national level. And can you say anything about the extent to which there's been any progress at all, any kind of policy learning, any evidence of that in this process, even if it's tragically slow on the place? But are the policies that the national and the state governments pursuing in these homestead areas and related development kinds of issues getting any better at all, or was this just a big mistake?
Well, I mean, that's a really great question. It's in many ways the motivating question that drove this book. And so what I'm showing you is a sort of iterative process of revision. So in 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, and I should have, for purposes of clarity, just reinforced what the Homestead Act was at the beginning. So the Homestead Act offered up to 160 acres of land in exchange for 5 years of labor and improvements. And the idea was this would democratize access to territory and provide a rapid, sort of speed up the process of settlement. 160 acres in Indiana, in Iowa, in many parts of the Midwest is actually plenty of land.
Right.
In Arizona or Montana, it's really difficult to operate a farm with 160 acres. And so what you see in these iterative transformations of the laws are, the Kincaid Act offered 640 acres or 1 square mile in western Nebraska. The Enlarged Homestead Act was 320 acres anywhere that was not susceptible of irrigation. In other words, no water on site and not clearly irrigable. The stock grazing homestead was 640 acres for stock purposes, no requirement to farm. And then ultimately Congress ended homesteading in the continental United States with the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. And so the idea there was this didn't work. And there was no more land to distribute. And so as a consequence, homesteading was ended. Now there was a 10-year window for Alaska until 1986. And so you could actually homestead in Alaska until the 1980s. But ultimately the vast majority of homesteads had been claimed by 1920. And so though these laws remained on the books, they didn't actually have much impact. Has the government caught up, the federal government caught up? Well, the Taylor Grazing Act in 1936 sought to manage the unclaimed land of this region as grazing territory. So under what is now the Bureau of Land Management, these were essentially cooperatively managed grazing districts. Today, there's still talk, following Deborah and Frank Popper's idea for the Buffalo Commons back in the mid-'80s. There's still talk about like returning this to, I think it's called the American Prairie Project, which is really active right now in Montana as a means of, rewilding, as it were, these lands. A lot of this territory is now back in federal hands or, owned by some of these big media moguls as, vast hunting territories, or is being used for other purposes like oil and gas or ranching. So not exactly what the plan was initially. These are also places that are very difficult to administer because the population density is so low that, kids in northeastern Montana often ride 2.5 hours each way on the bus to get to school. And so population is so distributed that it's really hard to maintain services for folks who are living out in the farthest reaches of the plains. And so this is a policy and economic dilemma that the states don't really have a good solution to, and that has kind of gone off the radar of the federal government in some substantial ways. Good question.
This is a great conversation. Well, we have time probably for the last 2 expedited questions, Wes and then Gustavo, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, thank you. Mike kind of preempted my question a little bit, but I think I can still ask something useful. So I really like the way that you've laid out kind of your structuring of the movements. In particular, I guess from policy perspective, I'm most interested in the coda because it's like, in a sense, you observe like the formulation of the state, and then maybe this isn't the right term, but ultimately it's like a failed state in a sense, like they failed at their objective. And now we've got this state institution that persists beyond what its initial intention was for. And so I think that might be an interesting way to kind of frame it is like, what happens with this structure that was created and failed, but now still exists and is going to be repurposed to do something else. And in particular, how does that revisit the initial development? So like, initially we see like native voices regarded a certain way when the state's built up. Do those native voices come back now that the state has failed? Probably not, but that would be an interesting thing. I know in some areas of the country, there's like efforts to try to return native land. Does that happen in these places, etc.?
So it's a great question. And, the land back movement is, gaining speed in these parts of the country. And so while I was living in Kansas, the 5th generation descendant of a homestead family donated land and $10,000 to the Kaw Nation as an act of reconciliation. And so that has actually spurred a number of cultural projects that helped to, create a groundwork for the return of Njuje Wahobe ultimately, as it turned out. And so there is energy and momentum to revisit some of these questions about what to do with this territory. Certainly, the indigenous nations that were historically resident would be very keen to have their land back, especially if it's largely abandoned or being used, very intermittently. Ultimately, I think you're right. The state institution is no longer serving the purposes it was designed for. And it probably is time for a policy reformulation that addresses social and economic needs as well as cultural concerns more concretely. Though I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to call it a failed state, the unintended consequences have been quite challenging. I tell stories about 3 homesteaders who succeeded, but for every successful settler colonial movement, there were many that were not successful, and then many families who were displaced in the process and have had to make their way onto new lands. And so this is, the contest part is still ongoing. Try to be brief for my answers.
No, this is a great conversation. We'll continue on after this, but I know we'll wind it up here in a minute. Gustavo, and then we'll try to get Alfonso in here as well.
So super interesting stuff. So many questions are coming to my mind, but I will only ask one. So it's connected with my question too. To some extent, this doesn't look like an extremely dysfunctional process, no? So depending on the goals, okay? So essentially, if the idea was, so you start giving land according to some rule, then what is economically valuable is taken in a period that goes from 1862 to 1920. So that's a relatively short period of time. And what is remaining, well, given alternative uses of time and effort of citizens and people, it's not economically valued to be taken, and then that's over, no? In some places, the government learns that you need to offer a little bit of better deal for people to take it. And then, of course, there is a wide dispersion. So sometimes people discover that their projects didn't work, so they go out. But on average, these places were more or less settled, meaning that on average, you are paying something enough to attract people. So what I'm missing, if I structure things in that way, so.
I don't think you're necessarily missing anything. The question is, what is the goal? So if we're talking about, these polycentric circles of interest groups, what is the federal government's primary goal in offering homesteads? Well, part of the goal was to, provide a return on investment for the people who had voted the Republican Party into office in 1860. The Republican Party ran on this platform of free soil, free labor, free men. And the free soil was both slavery, enslavement free land, and also this idea of free land for yeoman farmers. That people had started talking about in the 1840s. And so the homestead idea was first introduced in, I think, 1846 by Andrew Johnson, who became Lincoln's vice president. It was first entered into the House of Representatives then. And so the idea of free land for the willing farmer was a part of the Republican platform. So once the South had seceded and there was no more conflict over what to do about the West, then Congress was able to pass this law, essentially empowering the working man and woman, because homesteading was eligible for men and women, citizens, and those who aspired to become citizens, thus excluding Asian immigrants and Native Americans, but allowing homesteads for African Americans and people coming from Central and South America and Europe. And so you're right, it's not an extremely dysfunctional process if we're thinking about the state as urging settlement and expansion and filling the continent as its primary goal. And by filling the continent, I think we can imply and understand removing indigenous people as part of that project. You know, that part I would call deeply dysfunctional just because of, you know, the ways in which that property transfer took place and its implications culturally. But you're right that, you know, ultimately homesteading achieved its purpose. And so the economic utility of grasslands has now receded, you know, with tractors and inputs, you know, petrochemical inputs and, you know, consolidation of farms and, you know, the changing landscape of production. You know, certainly we don't need 40 or 50 acres of each of these 160-acre homesteads in wheat, for example. So, you know, the desired utility of these lands has shifted. Their benefit to the state and to their communities has changed. And so ultimately, you're right. I mean, the utility was maximized through the 1920s, and then use regimes have changed since then. What this leaves, I think, is a more dysfunctional landscape because of the distances between people and the lack of services, the lack of employment, you know, the extreme rural poverty that exists in parts of these states. And you know, the way they are actually, you know, food deserts, in many ways, even as they exist in the midst of, you know, this American breadbasket. And so I think there does need to be some sort of reevaluation of highest economic and social value and how to, you know, retool. Folks up in the Dakotas are, you know, really returning to bison production as a way of stabilizing, especially indigenous communities, you know, providing slaughterhouses and, you know, ways of monetizing native species again. There are now like Great Plains safaris that you can go on. The University of Nebraska is really trying to generate a tourist landscape in these places, focused on the grasslands as, you know, a valuable and endangered biome, essentially. And so things are, I think, in flux. And I don't know what the answer is in terms of like how the future development of this region will unfold.
Well, unfortunately, our time has come to an end. I will connect you with Alfonso. I'm sorry we didn't get to yours, and I know Leslie just gave a comment. Bernie Fisher said, please get involved with, stay involved with the workshop. And Lee Austin gave a comment on there. So there's a lot of comments, keep coming in, questions. But thank you very much, Sarah. I really appreciate it.